Hi, and thank you for coming today. It's really nice to see you all. I'm going to start with a little story of something that happened to me quite recently. I was sat in a user's living room, and I would be sitting in many very similar living rooms in the next few weeks to come. And what I wanted to find out was what makes people delete an app. So I asked him, do you remember what was the last app that you deleted? He didn't have a clue, so I asked him, how do you normally decide? He grabbed his phone, and instead of telling me, he just picked out apps that he didn't find useful anymore, and right there in front of me, he just deleted them on the fly. He said, oh, I kind of do it in batches usually, and that moment really stayed with me because I couldn't stop thinking of all the time and all the effort that has been put in these apps, and they just disappeared like that. Maybe 10 of them in a couple of minutes were just gone. And the truth is that any of our apps can end up in that kind of deleting batch that somebody has and eventually will delete. And what we want to talk about today is how not to be the victim of a purge like this. How can we make sure that our products have a meaningful place in our users' lives? My name is Micha. I'm a designer at Made by Many.
And I'm Isaac. I'm one of the co-founders of Made by Many, and we're a digital product company. We've been going since about 2007, and we're a collection of software engineers, designers, user researchers, strategists, and product managers all working together. And over the last 12 years or so, we've launched 90 products in 14 markets. But earlier this year, Google Play approached us to develop a toolkit to help developers unlock sustainable growth. So let's start with this chart. This is the number of engaged users over time. And I think as an industry, we're all really familiar with the importance of showing value to our users as quickly as possible in the process. Equally, we're all familiar with the perils of getting that wrong, uninstalls and drop-offs. And where we really want to be is up there at the top, having a sustainable relationship with our users. And obviously, the choices we make as developers between those 2 points are really going to influence where people end up on that curve or line. And so we really believe, and this is what we are here to talk about today, is that relationship up at the top, the sustainable relationship, can be achieved by adapting to people's lives, by respecting their time and choices, and by prioritizing long-term value over short-term engagements.
The topic of sustainable growth has been of interest for Google for the past 3 years, and we had the ability to access all of that knowledge that they'd collated, all of their library of resources and research that had already have created. And we used our knowledge as app developers, and we created something that was less theoretical and a bit more practical and actionable. We usually work with our clients to identify new opportunity areas, and the research process that we followed for this project was quite similar. Many of you might recognize it, maybe you use a very similar process yourselves. We start with creating hypotheses, and we then sketch them up into something that we can show to people, and we can communicate an idea in a simple way. Then, by testing this with users, we capture their insights, their questions, and their comments, and we use that information to make changes and to repeat that process as many times as we need to have something that we know actually works.
Now, on this project, it's really important that our recommendations were as universal as possible, so we tested it across 5 different categories, including the big ones of health and well-being, dating, education, and yeah. It was also really important that our findings were representative of different concepts, different cultural viewpoints. So we tested in 3 markets, the UK, the US, and South Korea. And here we are, 16 weeks later, really happy to be able to share our recommendations for the first time. But the one thing we kept on coming back to as we traveled around the world was this big theme, that there's life outside our apps.
And that kind of sounds obvious, but it's not how we typically design, build, or test any of our products. Let's think about it that way. If that golden star represents our app, we often imagine it very close to our users' hearts. So we create user journeys that don't have any distractions or any interruptions. There's no real life in there. There's no other apps mixing in the process. We just have our own app. And actually, the reality looks more like this. It's more complicated. People have lives. They have doctor's appointments. They go out. They stay late with friends. They eat junk food. They make good decisions, bad decisions. They're just people. And they also have other things that require their attention, like all of their notifications and all their messages and emails, and all of that comes and plays a role, not to mention all the other apps on their phones. And still, we imagine it differently, but that's where our apps live. They're actually much further away than we would like to imagine. We maybe think about it that way because we are very interested in our own products. We see them very single-mindedly because we are proud of them. But also, it's because we need that kind of focus to be able to create something, right? But to be able to create better, we need to actually open up and look at the bigger picture.
So, how do we design for this reality? Well, today we're going to talk about 3 highlights. The first one, engaging on the user's terms. Secondly, helping users get back on track. And thirdly, and perhaps most powerfully, disengaging to re-engage. Now, some of these principles you may be familiar with, but it's really worth always reminding ourselves why they're so valuable and why they work. Others might sound slightly counterintuitive, but the longer you think about them, the more you realize they have a positive impact on long-term retention. So let's dive in. Now, the best way of navigating the complexity of what Micha has just described is allowing the user to engage on their own terms. But what does that actually mean? Now, some of the most successful apps help users meet an ambition. Let's say like learning a new language, getting fit enough to run a marathon, losing weight, or simply unwinding at the end of a long day. But how do we help people translate those ambitions into achievement?
So let's map it out. We can draw this as a bit of a funnel where we have a very big, broad ambition that can get broken down into more tangible and smaller goals. These goals then would spark individual tasks, and if they get completed, we have an achievement at the end. However, that's not quite as simple because there are things at play in this funnel. We have people's unique paths that they will take to achieve what they're trying to achieve. We also have their unique speed at which they'll progress and the motivation that is driving them to do that. If we think about somebody who wakes up early in the morning because they really like running and they go for a run, that's an internal motivation. But somebody else can do the exact same thing just to lose weight for a wedding because that's an external motivation that they have. So knowing that they have different paths and different speeds and different motivations, in order to not do some guesswork, we need to put them in the driving seat and let them decide how to engage.
So to be able to do that, we need to ask 3 important questions. Why do they want to do it? How do they want to do it? And when do they want to do it? And it's the features we build need to support the user all the time in answering these questions. So what I'd like to do now is take you through a couple of concepts that we tested, in this case mocked up as an app that helps you learn a new language. So we have 3 interface screens here. The first one answers the why question. In this case, the user is self-identifying the reason why they want to learn, whether it's for work, travel, or romance. And this step is really important because it helps allow the app to customize their approach and their content to what the user is looking for, helping them meet their ambition. The second screen helps break a large task into a set of smaller, regular actions, such as in this case, the number of lessons and their duration. Now, this is really important because it helps takes those lofty goals and makes them feel tangible. And you can see how the app is beginning to adapt around the way the user wants to use it. And finally, we put the user in the driving seat by inviting them to set their own schedule. And this is really important. It's a nice touch. It transforms potentially annoying notifications into useful reminders. It's all about giving agency and control and flexibility over their engagement to the user.
And this is a quote that really kind of sums it up quite nicely. It's all about actually having ownership. And it sounds very simple, but user truths often are actually simple, but we don't see them in action very much. We don't see them in many apps. And if we look back at these screens that we showed you, we can kind of start to understand why we don't see them everywhere. Firstly, at the beginning of development, any features of this kind would normally be deprioritized as something that's maybe too advanced, or it's just an add-on. So we can put it at the back of the backlog and forget about it. Secondly, from an experience perspective, we can see it as an extra step. So we might say, let's make the experience less friction. Let's just remove that and skip it. But actually, in the process of making the experience frictionless, we take away the control from the user. What we need to do is give them autonomy instead.
Okay, so this is the science part. Why does this work? Well, firstly, users need help translating ambitions into goals and then plotting the route to get there. And that's known as the intention-behavior gap. And the interface ideas we showed earlier help bridge it by helping users plan and complete tasks. Now, behavioral scientists refer to this as chunking, and it's our second point. Easy and well-defined tasks are far more likely to be completed and not overwhelm the user. And finally, and this is something that we kept on hearing in our field work as we traveled around the world, users expect apps to be able to adjust to their lifestyle and their schedule, not the other way around. It's all about agency and flexibility.
The second highlight that we want to talk about looks at helping users get back on track. And I know that a lot of us here in the room have seen this happen before. Someone's engagement either drops off over time or stops very abruptly. And we can imagine that that's happened because the user's given up on their goal, or maybe they don't like our app anymore, they don't want to use it. But the reality is often quite different. Maybe life just got in the way. This is one of the people that we spoke to. In her case, she had her phone and she broke it. And by the time that she was able to get it back from the repair store, she had completely broken all her habits. And behavioral science has a name for this. It's called the what the hell effect. It means that once we miss one goal, we just very likely, as humans, to just give up and not come back again.
Cool. So if stuff happens, how do we help users get back into a habit? Now, often we sometimes try to do this by offering different discounts or offers, or we step up to a heavier pace of notifications. However, those two solutions don't address the real problem. People get busy and levels of motivation shift. This is Suki in South Korea. Her motivation was beginning to drop, was beginning to flag, and this is the approach her app took to get us back on track. I'm sure we've actually all experienced this set of sad emoji faces, and obviously it didn't work. Now, when this happens, we can often make too many attempts to notify, and we simply get locked out of our user. They no longer take us seriously, and they no longer pay us any attention.
And we think that there's a slightly better way that we can approach this by creating content specifically for those users who have lapsed. They are bite-sized tasks or pieces of content that can snap somebody back into an action and back into a habit. These are some examples of what we tested. So instead of bringing somebody to a full lesson again, we can give them a short 2-minute quiz if we were a language app. Or we can have something else if we were a workout app. Instead of bringing somebody from the couch straight to a full workout, we can just give them a 3-minute stretch routine, or allow them to log one meal instead of all of them. This kind of functionality just needs to be small and manageable enough to get somebody back into the app. And the reason why this works is that this is something that actually we found a lot of people already have seen in apps that are their favorites, like our user Amanda in the US. She really loved that her app was flexible enough to only let her log the breakfast. But she knew that once she was in, it wasn't really that hard to log everything else. It was more that perception of effort and the getting started that was stopping her from proceeding. So given that she was already experiencing something like this, that is not something that no app has ever done before, but not many do it. And we think there are a couple of reasons why that happens. Maybe it's because we really, as developers, prefer building new things. So new users are more exciting, and new features are more exciting than maintaining what we already have. But that's especially meaningful to start building things for the users that might start lapsing that we hold already, especially if we have a subscription model, because we know how important it is to maintain those. And fundamentally, if we put that effort and that time, we'll be able to retain them for the long run.
Cool. So why does helping users get back on track work? Well, firstly, even small barriers can deter people from taking action, and this is known as friction cost. Providing small, easy ways to get people back on track really removes this barrier. And as Micha has just explained, we can do this with bite-sized content, so specific, targeted content, such as short tests, mini sessions, or other really achievable tasks that shows that your app has many ways to help the user. Finally, encouraging but non-patronizing language is really key. It's really easy to demotivate the user, or worse, unintentionally make them feel guilty.
So if we know that it's important to keep people on track, we actually, through that project, realized that it's even more important sometimes to let them take a break completely. And we call this disengage to re-engage, and it sounds a little bit counterintuitive at first, but it makes a lot of sense the longer we consider it, and it's a really powerful reminder that all of us are human. What kind of things do we usually do to get people to stay engaged? We have nudges, streaks, notifications, all sorts of different techniques that we use, and they're proven to propel somebody really well towards their goal. But they suffer from a little problem. They don't really adjust well to the real world, and in the real world, priorities can shift quite consciously. I want to introduce you to somebody. Her name is Grace. She is 37, and she lives in London. She's the kind of user we all really dream of having, because she uses her apps daily to meditate and also to learn a language. But one day, last year, her dad got suddenly very, very sick, and she had to drive backwards and forwards to the hospital to see him every day, and understandably, that became her priority. And by the time that he was better, she had time to be back in her usual routine. She came back to her apps, and all of her streaks were broken. She had to start back from the bottom again, and it felt super unfair, because it wasn't really her fault why this happened. And I know that maybe some of us have actually experienced that firsthand when we open up an app and we feel like we're being punished by it.
But what if Grace could pause her app and take a break completely? This was a concept that really resonated with the people we spoke to, the ability to preemptively tell an app that for the next few days, one wouldn't be able to keep up with it. You could pause your streak and stop your notifications with no question asked and no demotivating back to zero moment. Now, of course, there are other reasons for wanting to pause an app, and let's look at another category, dating. Now, no matter how often we heard the story that people really love dating apps as we travel around the world, one thing was also common, that people wanted occasional respite from matching with people or from receiving messages. And many dating apps simply don't allow you to do this, the ability to switch off. Now, even if you delete your app, in the background, your profile is still running and building up a backlog of messages and matches. The only alternative is to hack it, setting a location where there are no matches at all, like Antarctica, for example.
One of the app hackers that we met, Chloe from London, was really too busy to date with anyone or to bother checking messages over the week, so she only wanted to use it on the weekend. And we reckon we should just let her do that instead of having her delete and uninstall the app over and over again. So we've shown you this example of pausing an app, but there are other ways that you can help somebody manage their engagement and take a break. Some apps can preempt user behavior. So we know that people behave differently on a weekend versus a weekday. And this example here is pause your streak for the weekend. We know that you might not have the time for us. You can take a break. Some apps do it differently. They completely stop counting a streak once one is broken, and they switch to the longest held active days, which still makes the user feel like they've amassed an achievement, and they keep practicing to add to it instead of feeling like they're now at the bottom, so there's no point to come again. So features like this are available in some apps, but they're not particularly common. And why is that?
It might be because we have a lack of confidence that once we've let a user go, they're actually going to come back to us. Or it might be because, as an industry, we tend to view time in app as an absolutely key metric. And if this starts to drop, our engagement falls and we're seen as a failure. However, simply measuring time in app is not necessarily a good indicator of value exchange. And if we're honest, I think we measure it because it's an easy thing to measure it. But there could be far more valuable things we measure, such as the quality of interactions or users' real-world successes.
So, the science bit again, why does it work? Why does this engagement work? Firstly, if we're going after maximum engagement, we should be realistic and understand that this is unsustainable and also unrealistic. Experiences like that are the reason why we have the term digital detox, and none of us really wants to be toxic to our users, so we need to allow them to just switch off when they need to. Secondly, having zeros is very demotivating and can prevent someone from coming back ever again. So what we need to be focusing on instead is to celebrate success and progress. That's a far stronger motivation than punishment. And then finally, when our apps acknowledge that our users are human and their priorities are in their control, that begins to build a relationship that's actually healthy and balanced and one that can grow over time. And that's really kind of what sustainability is all about.
Cool, so we've just talked about these three areas, and I hope these features that we've just described sound like compelling. But it sounds like sort of like simple features that are easy to apply, right? But we're not simply suggesting that you sprinkle sustainable functionality over your app. No, it really needs to be baked into your development process. Now, so far we've talked a lot about the what you need to do to adapt around people's lives. Now we'd like to talk about the how. Good product management absolutely enables sustainable growth. And here's some best practice that particularly resonated with us on this project. Let's start with understanding our users. Now, this gets talked a lot as an industry, but not everybody does it well. And that's often because we have a tendency to rely on numbers, things like sign-ups, drop-offs, daily active users, and so on. But numbers alone will never tell us why a user has made a decision. My absolute favorite example of this is an airport group that wanted to understand how people were using their services and facilities. So they counted people, who was using what, and for how long. And one of their findings was that elderly people were disproportionately spending more time in the toilets than any other age group. Right? It's really easy for us to jump to a conclusion about why that was. But it was only when they started asking people that they got to the truth of the matter. Elderly people spend more time in toilets at airports because they're quieter and so they can hear the announcements more easily. Not necessarily what we were expecting, right? Here's an example from this project of a similar thing that we weren't expecting. Now, we knew from Google's research that intentional usage is a sign of having a really healthy relationship with an app. So we wanted to explore ways of being able to reduce and make people aware of mindless engagement. This
kind of message is something that maybe some of you have seen in your own feeds, and you're probably familiar with it. The hypothesis here is that once a user sees there's no more new content, they will take a break and leave the app for a bit. But the very first reaction that we got when we got to Korea was really humbling. Our local moderator had one look at our sketches and said, "Oh, that just means I need to follow more people." So we had to take a step back and think about it and be a bit more explicit about what we were trying to achieve. So we tried something a bit different. We wanted to tell people exactly how long they've spent in the app, contextually, within the feed, just like this, no pop-ups, anything, just simple. And I don't know if you would guess the reaction, but people were very triggered by that number. They thought that they were being judged. They thought what their phone was telling them what to do.
So people really felt they were being reprimanded, and this is a really strong emotion that we're dealing with. So we decided we wanted to add more context to help people understand why we were displaying this message. So we tried this. We tried adding a number. 67% of people are concerned about the amount of time that they spend online. So what do you think people said? We got many, many confused faces around the globe. In the UK, US, and South Korea, we heard the same thing.
I don't care what people do. I have myself, I have my family to worry about. This is useless information. So that kind of led us to our final iteration that eventually made sense to people. We said, you spend this much time, and that's more than what you normally spend. Now people began to engage with us. They understood why this was being shown. They thought, oh, maybe it's time for me to take a break. And they also started thinking about, maybe I'll customize the message, or maybe I will set my own time for this. And it finally felt like they were taking ownership of how they engaged. But to get to this, we had to go through all of the previous iterations. All of our assumptions were being challenged along the way, and we couldn't have just guessed or get to that thing in the end. And the reason why we're showing you this is because it's a really good example of how if you don't do that kind of process, you can build something wrong, and you can spend all your time doing that instead of focusing on the right features.
Secondly, let's talk about leveraging our brand values. Now, what do we think a brand is? Color, fonts, logo types, but really at its heart, it's about the features we build and the tone of voice we do that in. And we should only ever add functionality that truly fits and reflects our brand. And of course, what works for one brand might not work for another at all. And I want to demonstrate this by picking up an example from the dating app Bumble. I'm sure many of you heard of this. They have a really strong brand message of empowering women to take the first step. And their features and their tone of voice really reflect this. Now, earlier I talked about the need for pausing dating apps, and Bumble has a really great feature that allows you to do this. It's a snooze function that allows you to set a status message such as, I'm traveling, I'm working, or in this case, I'm prioritizing myself. Now, we wanted to understand how this resonated with people and how they responded to it, so we tested it ourselves by removing all of the branding. Now, I know this looks pretty simple, doesn't it? Pretty similar, but we've taken away the brand from its original context. Now, people reacted really strongly to this. We didn't get the reactions we were expecting. This prioritizing himself, people were saying, that's so rude. I would never say that in real life. However, we know this is a really successful feature for Bumble. But of course, taken away from their brand message of empowering women, it simply doesn't work. Imagine, for example, if we were to drop this functionality into a group family chat. Can you imagine what your mother would say if you said you were prioritizing yourself? I think your phone would probably burn up in your hands. But this kind of example shows that sustainable features that might work well for one brand don't necessarily work well for another if you take them away from the brand and away from the original context.
That's right. So I want to bring back this diagram that we looked at right at the beginning. We drew sustainable growth as this beautiful straight line. And you've probably noticed from our presentation that that sounds a bit like it's not really like the real world. It's not quite so straightforward. Really, it looks a lot more like this. It's all wobbly. And that's actually fine. We need to be able to embrace the wobbles. That's what the talk is really all about adapting around people's lives. Because if we don't do that, if we don't go with the wobbles, then we wouldn't be able to unlock sustainable growth. So embrace the wobbles. And before we leave, we want to show you something that we started introducing into our own process whenever we think of a new feature or whenever we design a new app.
So this is a checklist that we've created that we use amongst ourselves, amongst our design team, amongst our product managers and our developers and our strategists. We tend to ask these 3 questions. Firstly, do we let users interact on their terms or ours? Do we have an easy way to get users back on track guilt-free? And finally, do we allow our users to disengage when they choose to? And these are 3 really important questions that we feel it's necessary to ask whenever we're launching a new app or considering a new feature. Now, we hope this has been useful. Our full recommendations are being turned into a set of modules at the Google Play Academy for App Success. The 5 words most difficult to say in the entire talk. The modules cover everything from the fundamentals to engagement, branding, and monetization. But this is really a topic that continues to be a work in progress and something that Google are going to continue to be interested in for a long time.
So, thank you.